Good morning, everybody, and thank you for, is there, okay, now again, we try again. So thank you for joining in this morning. It's Saturday morning, and I'm very happy to see many faces in front of me. So, and also some people joined via Zoom. In this panel, so belonging, emplacement, home, let me briefly say a few words about the panel, and then I will introduce our keynote speaker. So in this panel, belonging, emplacement, home, we want to explore the question of the human being's sense of place. One of the central traits of human belonging is linked to emplacement. In the question of where we come from, where we live and dwell, where we stay, as opposed to non-places, of which Marc Auger spoke, spaces of transition, such as, for example, railway stations, malls, etc. The question is most likely to arise when we find ourselves in unfamiliar, alienating places, such as when we are forced to stay in a hospital for an extended period of time, or in an alienating part of town where there is a sense that we do not belong. Nevertheless, the question of where one feels to belong cannot be answered easily. Places of belonging, the positive localization of human beings, turns out to be complex and differentiated. Are places to be understood territorially, geographically, or can they rather be traced back to human beings' sense of meaning, as, for example, Heidegger did this? Should places be thought of at all only starting from the belonging to it, so that localization is to be understood actively as a finding or creating of places? It is in human habitation that the need for localization is most pronounced. What does it mean to dwell? Does it refer to human establishments, or does it existentially define human beings? Edward Casey on place, in The Fate of Place, let me give a short quote. We are immersed in it, in the place, and could not do without it. To be at all, to exist in any way, is to be somewhere, and to be somewhere is to be in some kind of place. Place is a requisite as the air we breathe, the ground on which we stand, the bodies we have. We are surrounded by places. We walk over and through them. We live in places, relate to others in them, die in them. Nothing we do is unplaced. How could it be otherwise? How could we fail to recognize this primal fact? End of quote. The question of home, the third term of our panel's title, arises especially with reference to the refugee and migration issue. Is home interchangeable? Can a new homeland be found or created? Or is home to be questioned as such at all, overtaken by today's mobility and globality? Beyond the frequent political misuse of the term homeland, especially in the refugee question, does homeland still have carrying power with reference to belonging of the individual? So we want to reflect on place and emplacement, Verortung, as it would be in German, as being differentiated, as well as on the precarity of home. Home as origin, the controversial, romanticized place of origin, which would be Heimat, which has been mentioned these days, translated as homeland, like in South Africa, Transkei, Ciskei, homelands, as they call it. So another name, indeed, for displacement, repatriation, enforced settlements, segregation. So is home as to be understood as an origin or as a goal, as actively built, done, reinforced, created? This is what we want to reflect upon. However, in view of constructing, deconstructing, reflecting upon belonging, place is referred to not only in its geographical meaning, but place as coming together of people, or event as place as coordinates of thought. Just to give a few hints. So I will leave it more or less as an open question, and I warmly welcome Jeff Malpas, our keynote speaker. So thinking about place, reflecting on emplacement inevitably leads to Jeff Malpas' work. We are thrilled to have you joining the vivid discussions at our conference. Thank you very much and a very warm welcome. And allow me to say a few words about you, although most of the participants certainly know you already. So Jeff Malpas is Distinguished Professor at the University of Tasmania and Visiting Distinguished Professor at La Trobe University. His work is grounded in post-Kantian thought, especially the hermeneutical and phenomenological traditions, as well as in analytic philosophy of language and mind, and draws on the thinking of diverse range of thinkers, including most notably Albert Camus, Donald Davidson, Martin Heidegger, and Hans-Georg Gadamer. His works include topics like the ethics of place, the failing character of governance, the materiality of memory, the topological character of hermeneutics, the place of art, and the relation between place, boundary, and surface. However, most of his books and many of his articles explore the nature and significance of place, as well as its connection to space and time, arguing for the intimate belonging together of human beings with the places they inhabit. Jeff Malpas is the author or editor of at least 25 books and has published over 150 scholarly articles on topics in philosophy, architecture, and geography. Allow me just to mention a few book titles, such as Heidegger's Topology, published in 2007, a book which, and thank you very much for that, at the time helped me finalizing my PhD thesis on Heidegger. A second book, for a follow-up book, which is taking up on the topic, is Heidegger and the Thinking of Place, MIT Press in 2012. And maybe I would mention a third one, Place and Experience, a Philosophical Topography, published at Routledge, discussing how the human being is bound to place as foundational to both subjectivity and objectivity, place being methodologically and ontologically foundational. Another two words, so most recently, Jeff Malpas announced as editor of a new book series, which might be of general interest, called Toposophia, Thinking Place, Making Space, published by Roman and Littlefield, a series dedicated to the interdisciplinary study of place and space. Of the many grants, prizes, and awards, I wish to mention the Humboldt Fellowship leading to extended stays in Germany at the Universities of Heidelberg, München, and Freiburg, and next time when traveling will be less troublesome, why not? It might be Tübingen. We are very much looking forward to your talk on belonging, emplacement, home, critique, and the task of retrieval. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just wish I could be there in Tübingen, and maybe I will get there sometime in the future. So thank you for that introduction and that summary of my work. What I'm going to do in this talk is possibly not so much talk specifically about the character of belonging as talk about some of the critique of belonging and emplacement and home that's developed over the last few decades. Because all three of these notions, which I take as topological notions, and topology is the term I take for the thinking of place, all three of these notions have been the subject not only of significant attention over the last few decades, but they've also attracted a great deal of critical attention. For some thinkers, these notions are irretrievably problematic, such that they would argue they perhaps have to be abandoned. And the reason for this is very often because these concepts are tied to notions of exclusion, sometimes violent exclusion. And so, for instance, the geographer John Wiley who focuses on the idea of homeland, claims that a landscape cannot be a homeland, and his rejection of the idea of homeland is intimately bound up with his rejection of a certain sort of place-oriented thinking. Now, my own work has taken place to be central, as you just heard, and that work has also tried to encompass both the continental traditions, the work of people like Heidegger, but also the work of people like Donald Davidson and analytic thinkers around language and mind. Now, what I want to do today is to talk through both some of the arguments against the ideas of place, home, and belonging that are important here, but I also want to why it is that these notions cannot be abandoned. In a sense, I want to say what's wrong with these critiques. Why are these critiques themselves problematic? What I'm going to do is, first of all, give you a brief survey of some of the main lines of argument here. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why place is indeed necessary. And when I say place, I'm really encompassing the notions of belonging and home there as well. And then thirdly, I want to talk about this task of retrieval, a task that remains even in the face of the contemporary critiques. Now, much of the critique of belonging and home seems to me to come to devolve, whether implicitly or explicitly, onto the critique of place. That's what happens, it seems to me, in John Wiley's work, but also in the work of a lot of other thinkers. Belonging and home are thus typically understood as notions that presuppose a certain relation to place, and typically that's a relation that's tied up to notions of identity. Put simply, when who we are is taken to be determined by where we are, to where we belong, whatever that means, then such place attachment or place relatedness is taken to give rise to various problematic consequences. Now, one of the best known and most frequently quoted examples of this critique is in Emmanuel Levinas's 1961 essay, Heidegger, Gagarin, and Us, written in direct opposition to the explicitly topological thinking of Martin Heidegger. Now, as the title of the essay already suggests, Levinas takes the freedom at issue here to be exemplified by the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin's achievement in escaping from the clutches of the Earth, Gagarin making the first human flight into space aboard the Russian spacecraft Vostok 1, completing a single orbit around the Earth and returning on April the 12th, 1961. Levinas argues that the release from the attachment of to place through technology is more important than any of the problems that technology may also bring with it. Now, underlying Levinas's critique and replicated and developed elsewhere in the literature are three main lines of argument concerning the relation of place and identity, or what Levinas calls place attachment. The first of these, that which is foremost in Levinas's account, is the idea that place is tied to exclusion, something I briefly mentioned before. If identity is tied to place, then the affirmation and preservation of identity seems to require exclusion of others from that place. The second, less explicit in Levinas, but evident elsewhere, is the idea that place is tied to a problematic form of determinism. If identity is tied to place, then this makes identity dependent on what is bounded, and so already determined, on that which cannot be matched, and to the determination by which one can only submit. For Levinas, this is especially problematic inasmuch as it makes the human subservient to place. And so this is part of what is at stake in Levinas's famous claim that place-based thinking, Heideggerian thinking in particular, is really a version of paganism. The third, really only hinted at in Levinas's essay, is that the connection of identity to place involves an essential nostalgia. If identity is tied to place, then this ties identity to a certain mode of temporal orientation, specifically to an orientation that privileges the past and refuses to engage with the future. Now, what's centrally at issue throughout this general form of critique, whether in Levinas or elsewhere, is the character of place as tied to boundary and boundedness, the latter being understood as essentially exclusionary and restrictive. Whether the boundedness of oneself by place, or the boundedness of the other, or the boundedness of the past as against the supposed openness of the future. It's this issue of boundary or of boundedness that can be seen to lie Levinas's claim that the attachment to place is the basis, quote, for the very splitting of humanity into natives and strangers. My claim is that the critical engagement with place, because it's so much focused on this notion of boundary, which I have argued elsewhere is central to the concept of place itself, is thus identical with the critical engagement with boundedness, with the boundary. Now, boundary or boundedness, as it appears here, is more or less the same as horizon or limit, and is etymologically as well as semantically distinct from the other senses of the word bound in English as being tied to or by, springing forth, or heading towards. The idea of boundary is not, it should be noted, an additional notion over and above the idea of place, in fact, but is intimately tied to it, at least so long as we do indeed treat place as a sui generis notion with an irreducible content of its own. The ideas of topos and chora, which are the Greek precursors to the contemporary idea of place, combine two notions, that of dimensionality and boundedness, so that the former, dimensionality, arises on the basis of the latter, boundedness. The boundary is that which gives room to that which appears within it. Now, this idea of place is not only evident in Plato and in Aristotle, but it's also evident in more recent thinkers, such as Georg Simmel, I think is an underappreciated source here, and who focuses specifically on the idea of the boundary, and famously Martin Heidegger. In fact, Heidegger's thinking is, I think, fairly obviously indebted to Simmel's, particularly on this thinking of the boundary. In particular, Simmel's essay Bridge and Door, which prefigures a great deal of what is present in Heidegger's Bauern, Wohnen, Denken. And Simmel's thinking, Heidegger's thinking of place, of course, especially as it emphasizes the idea of boundedness, is so often the target for many of the critiques of place that are at issue here. Now, if we treat place as more or less interchangeable with space, if we interpret place in terms of space, which in contemporary parlance almost always means to interpret place as a modification of physical extension, then place needn't be tied to boundedness simply because space is not so tied, or at least not intrinsically. When place is understood as it often is, as identical with some spatial location or area, the demarcation of which is essentially contingent, then the boundedness of place also becomes contingent, just as place becomes contingent with it. The possibility then arises of a notion of place that stands outside of the standard criticisms of place simply because it's no longer a notion that carries any special content of its own, and certainly needn't be seen to be tied to boundedness or to exclusivity, determinacy, the past, or whatever, or indeed to belonging or home in any strong sense. And so a writer such as Doreen Massey can argue for a progressive sense of place when what she actually means by this is a notion of place that is more or less identical with the idea of a contingent spatial domain, a domain within an indeterminate and spatially extended field. Now, that's not how I use the notion of place, but it is one way of thinking about place that, if you like, escapes from the critique, but does so, of course, by emptying place of any genuine content of its own. Now, the lines of argument at issue here regarding place as exclusionary, as nostalgic, as determinate and determining are evident in the work of many different writers and thinkers, perhaps most notably in the work of Levinas, but also in Theodor Adorno's work, both of who also, like Levinas, formulates his thinking in direct opposition to Heidegger, in the work of Doreen Massey, who I've just mentioned, as well as David Harvey, both prominent figures within contemporary geography, in architectural theory, in the work of such as Hilda Heinen, David Leach, and Mark Wigley, and is also elaborated across other disciplinary domains in ways that draw on a variety of theoretical frames, from critical theory to psychoanalysis, from feminism to postmodernism, Marxism to liberalism. Such critiques are now so commonplace, in fact, that in some fields they have become almost taken for granted. Now, there's another line of argument that also appears in the discussion of these notions, especially in the discussion of place or emplacement, namely that such ideas are at odds with the character of the globalized, dynamic, interconnected contemporary world. In other words, that these notions are not only fixated on the past in problematic fashion, but that they may belong to the past. This is something to which I shall come back towards the end of my talk. Since what's at issue here is directly tied up with what I see as a convergence between certain key elements in the critique of place and the increasingly spatialized modes of ordering that are characteristic of the contemporary world. Now, there's no doubt that the language of home and of belonging and place have frequently been developed in ways tied up with problematically exclusionary and even oppressive and violent forms of thought and action. One only needs to look to the rhetoric of many contemporary right-wing politicians, but also the more specific rhetoric around Brexit in the UK, for instance, to see how ideas of home can enter into reactionary politics. The startling way the language of homeland became part of the political vocabulary of governments across much of the English-speaking world after 9/11 reinforces the sense in which home can readily become associated with xenophobic insecurities and repressive forms of governmental control. Yet the mere fact that the language of home, belonging and place can function in this way, although it may tell us a great deal about the prevailing political and cultural climate, and that has a direct impact on the way in which language is used, that actually tells us very little about the terms or notions that are themselves in play here. And that there may be a distinction between the way terms and ideas are deployed and what is really at issue in those terms and ideas is itself part of the very ground for the possibility of a critique. Moreover, too narrow a focus on particular ideas of home, belonging, and place can readily obscure the ubiquitous nature of such ideas. In fact, notions of home and belonging are no more the exclusive preserve of conservatives than notions of freedom or justice are the exclusive preserve of progressives. Such ideas have been drawn upon by, and continue to be drawn upon, by groups and individuals from across the political spectrum. The ubiquity of the language of belonging, place, and home is itself something that's worthy of comment, since it reflects how entangled these terms are with everyday language. That they are so is a direct reflection of their centrality. In this respect, belonging, place, and home are no different from other key notions like justice, truth, and the good that figure prominently in social and political discourse as well as elsewhere, in ways that spread across the entirety of the political spectrum. It is because notions of home, belonging, and place are so central that they're also so frequently appealed to in a range of political contexts. And that they are central in this way is a consequence of what you heard a little bit about in the beginning, in the introduction to my talk, of the necessarily placed character of life and existence. Okay, so that brings me to the second part of what I want to talk about, the centrality, or what we might even call the necessity of place. And so too of notions of belonging and home, the sort of necessity that was alluded to in the comments you heard from Ed Casey's work. Rather than being notions that we can simply pick up or put down as if they were simply tools lying around, the ideas at issue here arise out of our existing being in the world and are reflective of the character of that being. In other words, they constitute already extant phenomena rather than being merely elements in or artifacts of certain ways of talking and thinking. Now, part of what comes into view here is a point about the very nature of philosophical reflection and the way this notion of what I'm calling retrieval might be part of such reflection. And I'll come back to that later. But what I want to do for the moment is to simply look at the way, very briefly, how ideas of place, belonging, and home are connected with other key concepts, of which perhaps the most salient is that of the self. Now, if we treat the latter term in a purely formal sense, without yet offering any substantive account of what it might be, then the self is that which is referred to in the first instance by the first person pronoun I, and which is also therefore a certain locus of agency and perception, and ultimately of deliberation and judgment, that also figures to varying degrees in such action, perception, deliberation, and judgment. No matter how much we might claim to be able to deconstruct the self, the fact remains that the self is necessarily implicated at the most basic level in the structure of action and perception. Without a capacity to distinguish self from environmental context, including from other agents, there can be no possibility of directed action or even of any integrated perceptual engagement with things, certainly not of deliberation or judgment. In phenomenological terms, the self is part of the necessary structure of intentionality. And similarly, in terms of empirical cognitive science, the self is a necessary part of the structure that makes cognition itself possible. Now, the ideas of home and of belonging are both directly connected to the idea of the self. They are terms that relate to the way in which the self is articulated in the world. This is especially the case if one understands the self not in terms of some underlying substance, but rather as a nexus of action and reflection that is both internally and externally differentiated. That is, as a complex and dynamic unity of attitudes and dispositions, as well as comportments and behaviors. The self is, by its very nature, even when understood purely formally, a mode of differentiated existence. As such, the self is constituted both through its connectedness to the world and to others, and by its differentiation from the world and from others. Home and belonging both refer to this structure of identity, connection, and differentiation. There are as many different forms of home and belonging as there are different modes of articulation of the self. Modes of articulation that vary according to environmental context, historical background, and social and cultural situatedness. The latter give rise to the contingencies of the self, but that there is a self and that it has a certain structure that is realized in and through those contingencies is not contingent, but necessary. As soon as one grasps the idea of the self as extended into the world, to use the language of contemporary 4E cognition, as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, then one must recognize the self as necessarily emplaced also. 4E cognition is actually underpinned, I would suggest, by a 5th E, though it's one that is fundamental to all the others, that 5th E being emplacement. This is not a point that applies only to the self, of course, but to the mind, consciousness, mental content, even to agency and sentience in general. Moreover, this idea of the emplaced character of the self and of existence that is articulated in contemporary cognitive science is also articulated in various forms of externalism as developed within analytical epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind. And for me, Donald Davidson's work is important there. But it can be argued to already have been adumbrated in earlier work in ethology, psychology, and especially phenomenology. So Heidegger's Sein und Zeit from 1927 already sets out in a form of externalism, or what I would call topologism, in its idea of Dasein as being in the world, which even in 1929, Heidegger was connecting to the idea that has come into English, somewhat problematically in my view, as dwelling, namely wohnen, sich aufhalten, and that also has connotations of home and of belonging. It's this idea of self and existence as, and this idea that we find in Heidegger, this externalism or topologism, it seems to me, is something that we can find articulated in various ways in phenomenological thinking from 1927 onwards. We can find it in a whole stream of phenomenologists up into someone like Ed Casey today. And not only in phenomenology, of course, but also, as I said, in psychology, Gestalt psychology in particular, but also in a whole other range of branches of psychology and sociology and anthropology, and significantly too, in indigenous thinking, which I think is worth drawing attention to here. The knowledge of indigenous societies and their experiences in the face of colonialism itself draws attention to the intimacy of the relation between identity, life, and existence, and the places in and through which life, existence, and identity are formed and shaped. In Australian Aboriginal thinking, Australian Indigenous thinking, this is captured in one way through the idea of Narangani, one of the words, this is one of the tribal words for this idea, often translated into English as the dreaming or dream time. This means that in an indigenous context, a claim such as Wiley's, that a landscape cannot be a homeland, is rather harder to make in country to an indigenous audience in Australia, say in the Ananda country of Uluru, or the Meningi Mungai country of Kakadu, than in a lecture hall in Brussels or in London. Now, this idea of self and existence is necessarily emplaced that we can find in the work of Heidegger and indigenous thinking, in a whole host of other works. That idea and the centrality of place that's associated with that can be seen to reflect the inescapable character of existence as always an existence in the world. But as such, it's also worked out in terms of specific places and spaces through specific forms of home and belonging, and at the same time is differentiated from the world. Existence is this emplacing and belonging, which is also a differentiating, but it's not something that occurs in some metaphysically strange domain. It occurs only in the world, which means in these concrete spaces and places. As this mode of existence in the world, this mode of emplacement is fundamentally active, and that's a theme that runs through all of the thinkers that I've been alluding to here. So the character of the emplacement is always itself dynamic and negotiatory, and cannot therefore be understood in terms of any simple deterministic structure. Moreover, the emplacement at issue here is almost always understood as indeed tied to what I talked about earlier as the boundary or boundedness, or more generally, particularly in the phenomenological context, to finitude. Indeed, one of the great insights of many of the most important currents of philosophical thinking in the 20th century, although it has its roots in the 18th and 19th, including, I would argue, in the work of Immanuel Kant, is the idea, especially evident in hermeneutic thought, that it is precisely boundedness, which is also to say emplacement, that makes possible cognition, knowledge, understanding, existence, rather than being merely restrictive of them. Such finitude is also tied to facticity, to the always already character of existence. And it's this that underlies the stereotypical criticism of place-oriented thinking as nostalgic. But the recognition of facticity is just the recognition of the historicality of existence, and so of the necessary historicality even of the future, as well as of the character of existence as always given over to one, rather than being that which one simply creates or over which one can exercise mastery. And in fact, I would argue that this is one of the answers to this question as to whether or not places are created or made. Places, as it were, are always that which is found already, to which we respond, rather than that which we simply make. Facticity also involves a recognition, facticity and finitude involves a recognition of the inevitable character of existence as permeated by the experience of fragility and loss. And it's this that is the ground for the very real nostalgia, the melancholia that belongs with the experience of emplacement, of being in the world, of belonging to the world, even of being at home. And this can also be said to give rise to the uncanniness, the eeriness, if you like, that is itself part of the experience of place and home. To be emplaced is to be given over to a world to which one belongs, but which does not belong to one. A world to which one is subject, but which is not subject to one. A world that always exceeds any experience or articulation of it. Ideas that are powerfully evident in indigenous traditions around the world and also present in modern thought and culture, but which seem almost entirely absent from the formations of contemporary political and economic life, in which the emphasis is on subjugation of the world, on the unboundedness of our capacity to act in relation to the world. Very different sort of orientation from that which comes with an emphasis on emplacement. Already, near the beginning of Western thinking, Aristotle reiterates what he takes to be a common claim to the effect that to be is to be emplaced. This is in physics 4. And this idea captures the positive and productive sense of place and emplacement that emerges so strongly in much of the thinking over the last century or so. It's this positive and productive sense that underpins what's at issue in the fundamental role of notions of home and belonging. That role is one that can be clearly discerned in the analysis of cognition, of action and perception, of mental content, of memory, a topic I haven't really talked about, but which deserves a more extensive discussion of its own, of knowledge, and of the self in general. Now, belonging, emplacement, and home name contemporary problems, but they do so not because these notions are problematic, not because they retain some sort of illegitimate currency, but rather because of the problematic relation to place that has emerged as a key feature of the contemporary world. The homelessness and displacement that is now such a common feature of societies around the world, and that is evident in refugee camps and border zones, is present on the streets of almost every major city, and which is a continuation of colonialism and racism as a result of war and political disruption, as well as being one of the products of globalized capital, is indeed a problem precisely because it concerns a lack of home and a disruption in place. And this is not merely about a lack of physical shelter, but as might be expected, given what I've said so far, about the absence of the conditions that enable the flourishing of life and existence, and that also enable the sense of identity and of belonging that contributes even to a sense of community, even of a pluralistic community. Here it's worth noting that rather than the ideas of place, belonging, and home being antagonistic to plurality and difference, they in fact provide their necessary preconditions. Indeed, the idea of a pluralistic community cannot be anything other than cannot be the idea of a community that effaces home or belonging, but is rather the idea of a community that gives home to the plurality of different homes and forms of belonging. Plurality presupposes difference, but difference is precisely what is articulated through the different modes of being in the world that are worked out only in and through different places, different homes, different identities, different belongings. The problem is not the existence of difference, nor of the boundedness that is a necessary part of difference and the working out of difference, but rather the refusal of boundedness and the denial of the mutuality that itself belongs to differentiation. Far from being merely exclusionary, place, and so boundedness with it, opens up the possibility of inclusivity, of plurality, of difference, which is always also an inclusivity, a plurality, a difference that appears in and with respect to concrete places, in and with respect to our own place, and so our own relatedness to the world. If the boundary, like place, is productive in the sense I suggested earlier, then that productiveness applies both to what is within and what is without the boundary. The boundary is that which establishes the possibility both of differentiation, but also communication or mediation across difference, which is why the border, the bounding path or limes, hence the liminal, is such an important place. It is thus that every boundary connects at the same time as it disconnects. Now, this idea of the importance of the boundary and the way the boundary connects to other places is reflected in the character of places themselves as always entangled with other places, both within the place and without. So to be in place is not merely to be stuck within a single enclosed space, to use an example Walter Benjamin used, as if we were enclosed within a hard shell, but rather is to be embedded within a complex of places. Every place opens to other places, just as the boundary of the horizon beckons one towards the other places that lie beyond. And every place opens up to other places within it. Even the most familiar place is thus capable of revealing new discoveries inside it. something made very evident, of course, in Gaston Bachelard's work. And far from being determinate and determining, the place and so also the boundary is what opens up to the indeterminate at the very same time as it allows a certain limited determinacy that occurs in the very placing of things here, in this place. It is because of the necessity of place that the retrieval of place, by which I mean its rethinking and recollection in the face of its forgetting and refusal, is such an important task. Even the attempt to assert the need for the abandonment of place takes place from within its own place and on the basis of an existing orientation to the world and to thinking. All thinking, all critique begins somewhere. The question is whether it attends to where it begins and whether it attends to the boundaries that make such critique or its articulation, leaving aside its viability, possible. One of the problems with much of the recent and contemporary critique of place is its refusal to attend to its own place, which means to attend to its own boundaries and presuppositions, its own grounds. As a result, such critique often operates through the repetition of standard tropes and assumptions, like those regarding the character of place as invariably given over to exclusion, to determination, and to the problematically nostalgic, and often with little or no regard for the sort of considerations that I sketched out earlier. One of the reasons for this, I think, is tied up with the discursive insularity and internalization of much contemporary critical discourse. Too much discussion remains within the circles of engagement established by familiar texts and theoretical positions. Critique thus becomes a purely textual practice rather than a genuinely reflective engagement with the issues at stake, which is not to say that the engagement with text is unimportant, but only that one cannot remain entirely inside the text alone. But associated with this is also a tendency for that insularity and internalization to be reflected in a tendency to operate with respect to already assumed ideological or polemical positions. And so the critical engagement with an idea or issue becomes simply expressive of a certain politics rather than showing how, for instance, a certain political response might emerge as a consequence of what is at stake and as appropriate to it. Moreover, directly connected with this is a tendency to refuse consideration of what might be termed the ontological in favor of a focus on the affective and discursive. Suspicion of ontology has a long history in the social sciences and beyond, especially where the ontological, often identified with the metaphysical, is contrasted with the empirical, the variable, and the contingent. Sometimes the eschewing of ontology is defended by a sort of Rawlsian argument concerning the plurality of conceptions of the good. But in fact, most contemporary critique, especially in as much as it aligns itself with a broadly progressivist agenda, is not at all agnostic in this way, but holds to very clear conceptions of the good, even if not always made explicit, as these might be played out in the domain of the political. And one might argue, in fact, that this is also true even of Rawls's position, Rawls's claims to the contrary. Moreover, when it comes to the critique of notions like belonging, place, and home, there seems little reticence in asserting the problematic ethical and political content that is supposedly intrinsic to them, a claim that is itself implicitly ontological in character. It is a claim about the very character of those notions, about their fundamental character, about rather than merely concerning particular instances of their deployment. If critical engagement is to be more than mere polemic, if it is to be part of a genuine attempt at thinking, then it has to involve reflection both on the phenomena at issue and the framework of the thinking from within which those phenomena are approached. This is a familiar hermeneutic point. To paraphrase Gadamer, all critique is a form of self-critique, and all critique must take the form of a dialogue in which something is at stake and in which what is at stake must be given space to appear in its own terms. There is an ethical imperative to critique that emerges here that follows from the way critique is embedded in its place. And in fact, I would argue that ethics itself is only well understood when it is understood as tied to place, although this is a topic that would take us very far away from my immediate concerns here. To attend to what is at stake is also to attend to the character of that phenomenon, and so to enter into what is ultimately a form of ontological inquiry, an inquiry ultimately founded in the being of things. And that, of course, is a large part of what I was talking about in relation to place, identity, and the self earlier. My focus was on the character of place and the self, on what they are, rather than merely what is said about them. The task of retrieval, understood as having this necessarily ontological character, is not some esoteric practice predicated on a special kind of access to an otherwise hidden essence to things, but is rather a matter simply of rethinking what we already think, or what we already think we know, in a way that attends to what is actually at issue and to the phenomena that draw our attention in the first place. And such retrieval is especially important when the phenomena in question are indeed as central to life and existence as our belonging, place, and home. Now, the topological ideas that have been at the center of my discussion here are central to critical inquiry, as to any form of inquiry, because they are themselves part of the restructure of thought as they belong to the structure of being in the world. And this is, of course, an ontological claim, but one that's not only eminently defensible, but one that cannot simply be dismissed by some blanket dismissal of the ontological in general. But these ideas also have a key role in terms of the attempt to engage critically with our contemporary situation, our contemporary place. This was suggested earlier by my brief comment on the character of homelessness in its various forms as a worldwide problem that goes beyond, even while it includes, the problem of physical shelter. But it isn't just the loss of home that makes these notions so significant. The history of modernity as a worldwide phenomenon is a history that is itself closely tied with topological and spatial structures and developments. One might even say that modernity has its origins in the separating out of space from place. This has taken various forms. It appears in the history of ideas, a history well elaborated in Ed Casey's work, in terms of the development of a notion of physical space that is not dependent on any notion of boundedness, but is instead tied to the idea of homogeneous isotropic extensionality or dimensionality, and of place as entirely secondary to this, becoming merely the idea of a location or area within such an extended domain. This spatialized way of understanding is tied to the quantitative and to the numerical. It's evident in the character of contemporary science as predicated on quantitative and numerical analysis, those disciplines that resist such quantification running the risk of appearing irrelevant or unscientific, in the character of modern organizations as subject to purely managerialist mode of operations that are themselves centered around quantitative, numerical, and increasingly automated systems, in the transformation of social relations through systems of personalized, electronic, and surveilled communication and exchange based around the computer and mobile phone, and including media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook, and through the structure of globalized corporate or oligopoly capitalism that is itself intimately entangled with the quantitative and the numerical, with the managerialist and the technological, at the same time as it is also reinforced and reinforcing of all of these. If we refer to this spatialized mode of world formation, in which everything is drawn within the same all-encompassing and ultimately reductive system as technology, then we may perhaps recognize it as essentially the same phenomenon that Levinas identifies in his valorization of Gagarin's escape from the Earth. The escape from place is precisely, though now in a twofold sense, the escape into space. But this is an escape into the purely quantitative, the numerical, the manageable, the monetizable. If that were not already clear, then simply reflect on the names that are the contemporary counterparts to that of Yuri Gagarin. And I'm not thinking of James T. Kirk, but rather of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. In the case of Levinas, part of what makes this evident, though it requires some elaboration, is the philosophical foundation of his thinking in a form of Cartesianism, which is itself precisely a privileging of space over place. But among many of the contemporary critics of place, one finds a similar privileging of space that also replicates the structures at the heart of contemporary managerialist, technological, globalized capital. Structures of unbounded connectivity, of what Heidegger refers to as the unbounded in framing or positioning. And this is true, ironically enough, even of those writers like David Harvey and to some extent Doreen Massey, for whom the critique of capitalism has been so central. The underlying problem with the spatialized mode of world formation that's evident here is that despite its seeming effacement of place, it remains ontologically founded in the same topology that I described earlier. The Aristotelian dictum that to be is to be emplaced remains no less true in 2021 CE than it was in 350 BC. Consequently, the spatialized mode of engagement that characterizes contemporary thought and practice is in direct conflict with the topological structure on which it necessarily depends, a topological structure that it both obscures and forgets. And here there's a direct analogy between the critique, the contemporary critique of notions of place and belonging, and the way in which those critiques themselves nevertheless enact their own forms of placing and belonging. It's the retrieval of the topological structure at issue here, and the task of remembering and recollection that that retrieval entails, that is the real challenge for contemporary critique. Fundamentally, it is a matter of coming back to a place that we never really left. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your rich presentation. And so the connection worked quite well. We were a bit worried about this. It's 8 o'clock in the evening in Tasmania, so people are watching Netflix and so on. But it works quite well till now. All right, so I would open the discussion to the public. And thank you for bringing these new, several new dimensions, such as the question of boundary, I would think, and also we haven't really addressed till now the problematic of finitude, but let's see what question will arrive from the floor. So Niels, please.
Jeff, thanks a lot. This has been very interesting and very rich presentation, and probably I got no more than half what you said, but let me try. I got a couple of questions, and I tried to pose two of them. First is I'd like to know whether you would agree, and whether I kind of do understand you correctly. With respect to the notion of emplacement, you could think of a critique which similarly has been posed on the notion of embodiment. So if you, the critique on embodiment goes in the direction that to phenomenologically talk about embodiment somehow comes too late, because embodiment seems to imply that there is something that in second place becomes embodied. So there is an I or something else, a soul or whatever, that becomes embodied and then it takes place in this body, and by the body explores the world. While what phenomenology tries to show is the fact that human beings are bodily vulnerable points to points to different understanding, which does not mean there is an I somehow taking place in this body, but the body is the worldly appearance of this self. So you can't dissolve it, and the term of embodiment kind of doesn't really grasp this this phenomenological unity of self and body, and only and now you could think of a similar, an analog critique of the notion of emplacement, and say, well, emplacement seems to imply there is a self somehow taking place in the world, taking some space of the world, making its own, setting boundaries, and saying, this is my place. Here this is the act of my emplacement. I take this land, I set out boundaries here, and then Levinas' critique is correct, because by setting boundaries, I set boundaries to myself, I set boundaries to the other, and Levinas' critique would actually work. While we could understand this differently, and I'm just trying to, I'm just curious whether you would agree. You could also here say, well, you mustn't understand emplacement as a self-taking place in the world, making sense of some space there, but the self, well, I don't know how to say this, but the self by this emplacement only becomes constituted. So just like we are bodily selves, we are, I don't know, emplaced selves or spacely selves, I don't know how to say. And then this would allow, just like the body can be extended by, I don't know, whatever, by the bicycle, by the stick of the blind people, or so can the emplacement be extended. And the boundaries are not fixed, and they are not set, but they are fluid, and they are